Josh Comeau is up next. You may know Josh from online. He's a software developer and educator, a former engineer at Khan Academy, DigitalOcean, and Unsplash, and he's a webmaster wearing excellent pants. So thank you, Josh. Welcome on stage. Welcome, Josh, on stage.
Well, hi, everybody. Oh, this is so much fun. A very big thank you to the organizers. This is one of the, I've been to a lot of conferences, and you notice the little details, and they are flawless here. So I think we should start by just giving a big round of applause to everyone involved. It's been really good. I also had the delightful experience of being able to get a peek into Sarah's accessibility course, and it's absolutely incredible. So I highly recommend you take advantage of that discount code. All right. So I'd like to start with a scenario that I think many of us have seen before, something that has bedeviled all of us at some point in our career. Here's the setup. We have an image which is sitting in a container. The image doesn't really have much going on, some basic properties sitting in a section. The only CSS I've written is an outline, so that I want to be able to see the box, and I'll make this a bit bigger. Or no, that should be, well, let's try this. You'll notice there are a few little pixels down here. What are they doing? I typically, there's usual suspects for this kind of thing, right? We typically assume it's the box model stuff, like maybe it's some border, some margin, some padding. But in this case, we can sort of investigate it. There's no margin, there's no border, there's no padding. The image is the size that I have wanted it to be. And the container, the section, also has no margin, no border, no padding. And what we notice, this is the most baffling part of all. Let me see if I can do this. That's not the keyboard shortcut. This is juggling multiple things. We see that it is a very sneaky 256.33 pixels. So where are these 6.33 pixels coming from? I started writing CSS in the early 2000s, so it's been a while. And for most of my time as a developer, my mindset with CSS was that, I liked it. I knew enough of it to get by. But I wasn't really curious. I wasn't, when I would hit things like this, my mindset was to power through it as quickly as possible so that I could finish developing whatever I was working on. So I would Google weird CSS gap under image. You would find a Stack Overflow thread. You would scroll through, ignoring all the words, and just looking for snippets, like things that you can copy and paste and cross your fingers, and hope that, magically this problem goes away. These days, maybe you wouldn't use Google for that, but you might use the new robot tools that we have. And so just for fun, I asked ChatGPT, I gave it the scenario, and sure enough, it gave us some CSS to try. So let's try it. It wants me to, on the container, add line height 0. And check it out. Somehow, weirdly, bafflingly, the problem goes away. And so, had this happened to me in 2007, I would have said, great, let's go do more interesting things. There's a couple of problems with this mindset, though. The first is that it requires you to have a really good memory. I now have to memorize that when I run into this very particular issue, the solution is this totally arbitrary-seeming line height 0. And I don't have a good memory. So what's going to happen is in 3 weeks or 3 months, I'm going to run into this problem again and have to go through the whole process of understanding it again, or remembering the solution. But the bigger issue is that when you have this mentality for all of CSS, it stunts your growth. You wind up with a really shallow understanding of CSS because you never actually understand anything. You just memorize a bunch of little get-out-of-jail-free snippets. And that really sort of harms you as a web developer. So it was maybe 2017, 2018, that I decided I was sick of feeling this way. I was sick of feeling like my afternoon could be derailed at any moment by CSS just throwing me a curveball. And I decided that from that moment on, when I hit a situation like this, I was going to settle into it like it was a nice warm bath, and really just try to understand it, get a sense of what the problem is and why the solution works. And in this situation, check this out. The thing that really helped me understand it is what happens when there is text in this container. We see something kind of interesting, which is that the text, and let me zoom out a little bit, get this centered. The text is sitting on the same imaginary line that our characters are sitting on, right? In typography, we have this thing called a baseline. the image is just sitting like just another word in the sentence on this baseline. And we sort of forget, like, if I get rid of the image and I just have the text, this looks perfectly normal. And we don't even see the fact that, yeah, there is apparently 6.33 pixels of space between the bottom of the letters and the bottom of the line. And so, like, I discovered that, and it clicked, and I thought, that's why this is happening, and that's why line height 0 works. It works because, and actually, it can cause a lot of havoc too, because what we're saying is that each line of text should have 0 pixels of height, which, you know, that's not really what we want. Fortunately, it's not going to it takes the image's size more seriously than the character's size, so the container doesn't collapse. But, you know, this isn't really the best solution to this problem. Another option you'll see online is to select the image and to add vertical align. And this is a property that the default value is baseline, which is that imaginary line that the text runs on, but we can change it to bottom. And this has the advantage of not completely obliterating any other text that exists in that container. But it still sort of feels to me like we're treating the symptom rather than the disease. Like, the problem to me is that it's treating this image like it's part of the sentence rather than part of the layout. So the way that I would solve this today would be to set display block. And of course, this is going to force it onto a new line. Really, though, like, the problem that we're trying to solve is when there isn't any text. So we'll see if that works. And it does. Or maybe, you know, move this to the parent and set display flex. Also a valid solution. So in 2017, 2018, I started developing this muscle and settling into these problems. And it was kind of amazing. Like, all of these things that I had had to memorize over a decade of experimenting with CSS, they suddenly made a lot more sense. And I started seeing connections between things that had seemed totally disconnected. It really was, like I went from feeling like CSS was this inconsistent experience to something that felt really elegant and that I really enjoyed using. And as part of that, like, as I started getting better at it, I started building a reputation for myself. And at work, I became known as the CSS person, the person you would go to if the CSS was misbehaving for you. I'm sure this is, I'm not the only one. Who here has been the CSS person at work? And every hand goes up. It makes sense, right? We're here at a CSS conference. Of course, we like CSS. And it's a pretty cool position to be in because, you know, your developer friends will have been banging their head on some problem, and they come to you. And like when this would happen to me, sometimes I would be just as stumped, and we could, you know, it's an opportunity for us to learn together. But most of the time, I would see what was going on and be able to solve their problem. And it's a wonderful thing when someone has a problem that they've been struggling with, and in like 20 seconds, you can be like, oh, add this CSS, and the problem goes away. But it's even nicer to spend like 10 or 15 minutes and walk them through why this problem is happening and why the solution works. And I found that in these short conversations, you could really change someone's understanding of CSS. You could really fill in a lot of the gaps in their own mental model. And so in 2020 or so, I decided to focus on this. I left my job and I created a CSS course that I call CSS for JavaScript Developers. Very uncreative title, but it was named this way because I had... Sorry, what? Exactly, good SEO. It was so many of my peers who I was working as a full-stack JavaScript developer that had sort of the same challenges with CSS. Like they understood JavaScript really well, and they understood HTML well enough, and then like CSS was their Achilles heel. So I created this course. To date, I think something like 18,000 people have taken it, and I've answered hundreds and hundreds of questions about CSS. And that's kind of what I want to talk about here today. I suspect most of you in this room know CSS better than I do. So I'm not really trying to teach you CSS, but I want to show you sort of the most effective ways that I've learned to explain what are really sort of fundamental concepts with CSS. Like, CSS is having a moment right now, right? There's so much new, exciting stuff. We've been hearing about them today, like anchor positioning and scroll animations. And I worry a little bit that for so many JavaScript developers, Ruby developers, PHP developers, they're stacking on these new Jenga bricks onto a tower that's missing a bunch of blocks. So I want to try and cover some of those more fundamental things. The first thing I want to talk about, one of the biggest perspective shifts that I've had that has really sort of helped me with CSS, I used to see it as this giant bag of properties, And so as you're building a layout, you pluck out the properties that you need, like I need width over here and justify content. And that's fine, but I find it much more helpful to see CSS as almost like a collection of mini languages. So you have like Flexbox and grid and table and normal flow, and all these things are sort of independent but connected like stars in a constellation. And I'll give you a perfect example of why I think this is a more helpful mental model. The scenario here is that I have this div class item, and it has width 2,000 pixels, and then I have some cosmetic styles, because I realize the scroll bar here is really tiny, so you probably can't tell just how wide this element is. And if I take this item and I don't change it at all, right? I'm not changing it. I feel like this is a magic trick. I'm not changing it at all, but I'm just going to move it into a parent that sets display flex. Well, all of a sudden, it behaves very differently. Now, it is sort of growing and shrinking based on the container. And if you just focus on the properties, this is one of those things that feels like a quirk. It feels like an inconsistency, because I haven't changed the CSS at all. It's the same thing on the same element, but all of a sudden, this property is doing something totally different. Whereas if you see CSS as a collection of layout modes, well then what's happening here is that we're taking the same input, we're taking the same properties, but we're handing it to a different system, a different star. So this first one, it's rendered in sort of a default formatting context. There's nothing special about it, and so it's going to use Flow Layout, right, the default layout mode. And in Flow Layout, width is sort of, on a block element like this at least, sort of a hard constraint. Like if you ask it to be 2,000 pixels wide, you're going to get something that is 2,000 pixels wide. Consequences be damned. Like even if it has to burst through the side of the viewport like the Kool-Aid guy, you're going to get a really, really wide element. I don't know why I tried that joke recently and it didn't work, but for some reason I thought it would be good. The other element, right, this other element, we're writing the exact same properties, but we're handing it to Flexbox. And Flexbox has a different perspective on things. In Flexbox, it's not going to just take this value and apply it. It's going to work that into a larger system. In Flexbox, this is sort of a suggestion or like a utopian ideal, right? In the ideal world, if we have enough space, it would be lovely to have a 2,000 pixel wide element, but that's going to be filtered through the rest of the algorithm, and you're going to like maybe get a different output. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. So let's look at some of these layout modes. Let's look at them a little bit more in depth, starting with the default. And I know like people don't typically call it flow layout, but I find it helpful to have like Flexbox layout and grid layout and flow layout, so that's what I'm going to do. And the way I describe this is that it's the word processing algorithm. It works quite a bit like Microsoft Word or Google Sheets, and so I think it's helpful to explain this layout mode using an actual word processor. In Flow Layout, your page is made up of blocks. So you have this heading, you have a paragraph. If you had a table or a list, those would also be blocks. And in English, at least, blocks stack vertically. So each block is stacked one on top of the other. It's important to see this as like you have a fixed amount of horizontal space. Your page is only so wide. And yeah, like your page is only so tall as well, but you can have as many pages as you want. So you have infinite vertical space, but not a lot of infinite vertical, limited horizontal. And so we have these blocks. You stack them vertically. In each block, you can have like sub-selections of text or other elements. So like you'll notice I have some bold text over here. Maybe we have some red text or a link. And the curious thing, the surprising thing, is that images are considered inline. And I think we've all had this experience too, like working on school projects. If I grab this image and maybe I want to float it off to the side, you drag it over and it does this, which like is just not helpful. But where have we seen this behavior before of the image sitting as if it was just another word in the sentence, right? CSS was introduced at a time when the World Wide Web was a collection of hyperlinked documents, right? That was the main thing we were doing, was people were publishing documents that linked to other documents. And so it made sense. I mean, initially CSS wasn't even really designed for layout, but to the extent that it was, this was the layout that it was kind of integrating into. And I think this is helpful. And actually, it's kind of cool. There are floats, so you can even you can really see where CSS sort of got its roots. But yeah. Just for fun, let's sort of play with a similar thing in actual HTML. I have 3 blocks. I have a heading and 2 paragraphs. And the second paragraph has some bold text. So let's select it. And I think one of the things that really confuses people about inline elements is that like a bunch of stuff just doesn't seem to work. Like if I set height 100 pixels, well, it doesn't do anything. And I guess let's add an outline so that we can see what's actually going on. Whether it's 100 or a much bigger number or a much smaller number, it doesn't seem to have any effect. And the way I explain this is that inline elements, they're like pacifist, they're non-confrontational. They don't want to make a fuss. Like they just want to sit where they belong. They want to go with the flow. They don't want to cause any problems. They don't want to shift things around, at least in the block direction. Padding is kind of interesting. If I set, like, let's say 32 pixels of padding, well, it does something. The box, I know that's maybe a little bit hard to see, the box gets bigger, but keep your eye on this other paragraph, right? No matter what I do to this padding, that paragraph doesn't really move. So the box gets bigger, but it's not really affecting the layout. Now, in Inflow Layout, we have blocks, and we have inline elements, but there's a third value. And this third value, like for a long time, really sort of confused me. And I don't know if this is relatable. There are certain things in my life that I just have to keep learning them. Like I learn them and I think I get it, and then a few months pass and I realize I don't. Time signatures are kind of like this. Like I played the piano, and for a long time, the difference between 3/4 and 6/8, I just couldn't, like, they're both fractions and they reduce to the same thing, so what's going on? My partner studied economics, and every now and then I'll see like a financial term in the news, like quantitative tightening, and I'll ask him to explain it, and he will. And I'll be like, oh, okay, that's okay, good. I'll have some reaction to the news, and then I'll see it again next week and have no idea what the hell it means. And don't ask me to explain this because I'm still working on it. But yeah, inline block was one of these things for me where, you read these definitions, and they're very like I don't mean to pick on this definition. It's a very accurate and well-written definition, but if you don't have the depth of understanding, the words just wash over you, right? It doesn't really help unless you already understand what a block box is, or how things are flowing around surrounding content. Like, all of these things require a lot of understanding. So the way I explain it now is that an inline block element is placed on the page like an inline element, but unlike an inline element, it has a vote when it comes to block layout. So let's poke at this. Let's play around with it a little bit. I have a span, and span elements are inline by default, but I've given it inline block. And right away, like, it doesn't seem to do anything, right? It is still being placed in the paragraph the same way an inline element otherwise would. If I change it to block, well, then we see it has a big impact. Like, it forces itself onto its own new line, because block elements are kind of greedy like that. They don't want to share any inline space. So it doesn't seem to do anything compared to inline, but all of a sudden, I have access to things like padding or things like height. And they actually do, and I should be a good Samaritan and use rems for this. It actually does affect the block layout. We see that other paragraph moves down. Now this does sort of beg the question, if inline is like, or if inline block is like inline, but without any of the disadvantages, why would we ever use display inline? Well, it turns out that display inline has a superpower of its own. It's something that, as far as I can tell, doesn't exist in any other CSS context. Like, it doesn't work in Flexbox or Grid. And not only is it unique, it's super common. Like, every website uses this feature. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Yes, I heard it. Line wrapping. So I shouldn't have underestimated this crowd. We see that if we have an inline block element, it's always going to form a rectangle the same way that a block element always forms a rectangle, right? In this case, it behaves just like a block element, which means that we get a bunch of like dead space over here and over here. If I set it to be display inline, then all of a sudden, this blocky rectangle gets sort of chopped up into smaller rectangles. The way I like to explain this is just like a sushi roll, where it starts as like one big cylinder, and you chop it up, and you can like artisanally arrange it onto multiple lines. It's pretty cool. So that's the thing, right? And this is something that's important because a lot of developers, myself, I'm guilty of this too, we like building these fancy link effects where you have like pseudo elements that don't really work with inline elements. So you make your link inline block, but then you get into this problem like we had initially, and it encourages you to use really short link text to avoid this problem, which avoids the problem but introduces a new one, which is that your links are no longer helpful, which is a much worse problem. But so it's good to know that this is there is a reason for display inline. Let's talk about Flexbox. Let's move on to another layout mode. The way that I explain Flexbox is that it's another layout mode, so it's another one of these stars within the constellation of CSS. And it's primarily concerned with distributing items in a single direction. So whether you have like a bunch of stuff that you want to sit side by side in a row, or one on top of the other in a column, that's the purpose of Flexbox. It's a one-dimensional layout algorithm. Primarily, there is wrapping, so you can get away with doing some things in 2D, but for the most part. I built a tool to help us play with this. And the thing that I think is really cool about Flexbox is that everything, almost, I think gap is the exception, but almost everything is pegged to this idea of the primary axis. So justify content, align items, all the other Flexbox properties, they're not based in the world of horizontal and vertical. They're based in the world of primary axis and cross axis. And if I change the flex direction, it's like the whole system just rotates, and a property that was working horizontally will now work vertically. A lot of developers struggle with this idea of justify content and align items. And I think that like I was guilty of this too. You memorize them, so you remember the term justify content, you remember the term align items, and then whenever you have some Flexbox stuff to do, you try one, and if it doesn't work, you'd use the other one. I can tell that this is somewhat relatable, at least at some point in our career. Now, there is a bit of memorization that I had to do here, which is that justify refers to the primary axis. So the moment you see justify, it's always going to be pegged to the primary axis. When you see align, it's going to be pegged to the cross axis. But then the question is, like, why is it content and items? Why aren't they both content or both items? And this actually, there's a very good reason for it. It's because of the fundamental difference between the primary axis and the cross axis. I can draw a straight line that intersects all of the elements in the Flex container. And again, with Flex wrapping, this changes a little bit, but for now, let's pretend that doesn't exist. And I can't do that in the cross axis. So like there's no vertical line I can draw that ever intersects more than a single item. And that's interesting, right? Like that surely has some implications. Like if I have this second item, the word to over here, I can decide what to do with that independently. Like if I want, I could align it at the start, I could align it at the end, I could keep it stretching like it is now, and it doesn't affect its neighbors. Like it can do whatever it wants in this direction along the cross axis, but I can't do that in the primary axis. Like I can't say, take this element and move it to the start, because there's something there. Like it's sandwiched between these two other elements. And so when we think about the primary axis, we're not thinking about individual items that can each do whatever they want. We're thinking about it as content. It's a little bit like, and I'll get rid of our cat for now. In word processing, when we talk about text align, like when I align the content, I'm not thinking about individual words. Like I'm not thinking, okay, if I want to center align, this word has to move over this way, and this word has to move over the other way. No, you're thinking about it as content, as like a group of stuff that's all going to be aligned in one system, which is why we have these cool values like space between and space around. In the other direction, though, we're not thinking about content. We're thinking about individual items that can each sort of do whatever they want. So that's why that distinction exists. Let's talk about, and this is kind of fun, a bunch of things about this scenario. Like I mentioned, right, I have the CSS course. So many things in here have been tripped over by students in my course. And it seems pretty straightforward. We have a flex row with a label and an input. I'm aligning items to the baseline so that the label and the input, their text lines up. But check out what happens when I shrink it. Well, that's kind of weird. The label breaks onto multiple lines. And if I keep going, and this is a little bit hard to see, but the input overflows. So there's two mysteries here that I want us to unpack together. The first is, why does the label kind of prematurely split up like this? Like, why not keep it as a single line of text until you really can't fit anything else, like until it really feels like it's more of a crunch, right? The way that I would have solved this, and the way that so many of my students solve this, is by finding the magic number that works as a minimum width. So let's try min width, I don't know, 80 pixels. See if that works. Nope, that's not enough. 90. No. 100. Ah, OK, good. Now, it's a little bit too much. So if we add outline solid, we can sort of poke around with this until we find the exact perfect value. And of course, this is not how we want to do this, right? For one reason, the moment the label changes, well, now we have all this dead space that we have no way to get rid of. But there's a better way to do this, which is to use the actual flex algorithm and set flex shrink to 0. That essentially tells it, and I'll put back our other word, that this thing is sort of not allowed to shrink. Flex shrink is a ratio of how much one sibling should shrink relative to the others. And we're saying, no, this one should not be flexible. It should take whatever size it has been given and stick with that. Now, what about this input? Why is it sort of bursting through the side, even though, like, it seems like there should be more of an ability for it to shrink? Like, I've given it the flex 1, which is another one of these, like, you learn that this specific declaration does a bunch of things, or that, you just sort of try it and hope that it does what you want. But it doesn't do what we want because this input is overflowing. And, if I set flex shrink to a really big number, you would expect, OK, well, now it's going to do exactly what I want. But no, it doesn't. The thing to understand here is that in Flexbox, there's two sort of numbers that are really important to understanding the final value that we get. The first one we already saw, and I'll get rid of some of this stuff so we can see it again. Get rid of that too, which is the hypothetical size. This is what they call it in the specification, which I think is absolutely great. The hypothetical size is the size that this thing would be, again, if there was nothing else acting on it. So, if I set it to be 1,000 pixels, well, we don't quite have that much real estate, so it's not going to be 1,000 pixels. But that's one of the inputs. The other is the minimum content size. And we sort of saw this already with the input over here, or the label, rather. If I once again give it an outline. Come on, typing. Initially, and if I get rid of this, we see that it has this nice, comfortable spacing. If I keep shrinking, it wraps onto a new line, and then it'll keep shrinking until we reach this point. And at this point, it really has nowhere else to go, because there's no more line wrapping opportunities, so it can't shrink anymore. And if it were to shrink, it would wind up overflowing, and then it would show up behind the input, right? That's not what we want. And so this is the minimum content size for this element in this circumstance. And the surprising thing is that inputs also have a minimum content size. And it's not based on, like, the length of the value. I don't actually know what it's based on. I think it varies depending on the operating system. But in this scenario, at least, this is the minimum content size. And so, and I guess I'll put this back now. The magic incantation that developers learn to solve this problem is min width 0. And again, this is like that thing you memorize that you paste in if you're having some weird behavior and cross your fingers and hope that it works. And it does. I mean, I don't know that this is an ideal user experience. So, maybe we'll fix that by adding flex wrap. And now I think we have something that we can feel. Oh, and let's put flex 1. Yeah, I think this is pretty good, right? This is pretty, no, this isn't what I want. I guess let's set maybe 80 pixels as a minimum. Yeah, that seems good. And again, I should be using rems. So maybe like 5 rem. Let's try that. Yeah, this seems like a pretty good way to do it. But I think this example is so great because it shows a handful of things that seem arbitrary, like flex shrink 0, min width, whatever it is. But when you take the time to understand the flex algorithm, you can really be very intentional and very granular with the sort of thing that you want to do. And I think examples like this are a great way to show that because everyone has struggled getting this thing to do what we want and sort of finding the hacks to make it work. And if you can give the explanation to these properties, all of a sudden it feels a lot more intuitive. Let's talk about positioned layout. And this one's a little bit harder to explain because, like with Flow Layout, we can say, OK, it's the Microsoft Word layout algorithm. It's based on word processing. With Flexbox, it's the one-dimensional layout algorithm where we have a group of things and we want to arrange them either in a row or a column. Positioned layout is a little bit different because it's almost like there's sub-layout modes within it. The thing that they have in common is that you take the element, which is going to be in its otherwise calculated layout. Sometimes we call this inflow, which I think is fine, but also like that term predates Flexbox and grid, so now it should be like inflow or flex or grid, which I just think like calculated layout makes that a little bit easier to understand. So we take it out of that default calculated layout, and we anchor it to something else. And the something else is going to depend on which subvariant we're talking about. So in relative positioning, we're going to take the element, and I'm going to slap position relative on it, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything because relative position is relative to its calculated layout. So first, the other sort of layout calculations happen. We put display flex on the parent. This input has flex 1, which means that it's going to grow to be as big as the container will allow. But then it allows me to do some other stuff. Like I can say top 32, and now the input slides down. So first, it inherits whatever layout would otherwise apply, and then it sort of elevates it to this other layout mode that allows us to shift things around or do other transformations on it. Now, this isn't terribly useful on its own. Like, it's true, I do need position relative in order for the top property to work, but there's other ways to accomplish the same goal, like I can use transform. If I do this, we get the same effect. So really, I think relative position is most useful in tandem with other positioned elements. Let's talk about absolute positioning, which in my mind is like the magazine layout algorithm. Like if you ever want like a collage kind of effect where you want things to be sort of stuck wherever they need to go, this to me is the layout mode for that. And the cute scenario I have here is we have this pink circle, which I've given a class of teenager. And let's suppose that our teenager has been rebellious, and we've ordered our teenager to go to its room. And the teenager, though, has like a bit of an ace up its sleeve. And if it's absolutely positioned, check it out. It can break free of its room and go hang out at the address bar. It's my little joke. So this, to me, I think, is the level of understanding that a lot of developers who haven't sort of gone through the process of really understanding CSS, they assume that absolute positioning is going to be relative to the viewport, right? Like if I say top 0, it's going to be stuck. And I should mention, this is an iframe. So like this here is sort of the scope of the document. And that's true. And again, right, if we think of CSS as a grab bag of properties, that is true in some contexts, but not others. And that's what makes CSS sometimes feel kind of arbitrary. Because, as you may know, if the parent then says, no, 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 rebellious teenager, I'm going to slap position relative on here, well, then all of a sudden, our teenager is back in its room. And the way that I explain this is I say, OK, when the browser is figuring out where to put the absolutely positioned element, it's going to look to its direct parent, and it's going to check to see if that element also uses positioned layout. If it doesn't, it ignores it, right? That element will not contain this child, and it goes to its parent, which I think in this case would be the body tag, and up and up, then to the HTML tag. If it makes it all the way to the top without finding a suitable container, then it uses the initial containing block, which is a rectangle the same size and shape of the viewport. But any element in that chain, any ancestor, can become the container for that element by using any valid position property other than static. So relative will do the trick, so will absolute. All of those values will make this element act as the container for this child. Now, fixed positioning is one of the more easy ones to understand, but I still have a cute way to explain it. Imagine you're on a train and you're watching this beautiful landscape scroll by. And then imagine that a fly comes and lands on the window. Now, I was too lazy to get clip art, so we're going to use our imaginations and pretend that black circle is a fly. And what we notice is that it is no longer part of the landscape. So as I scroll, that fly isn't going anywhere because it's on the window that we're looking out of the train on, right? When we browse the web, it's similar. We have a viewport, which is our little window into the document. And as we scroll the page, it's like the landscape scrolling by. And anything that uses fixed positioning is like stuck to the glass of our viewport. Like it's no longer part of the document that is scrolling by. Z-index. Who doesn't love it? One of the things that I've noticed with Z-index is that a lot of developers overuse it. Like you wind up using it even when you don't need to. And a good example of that is this. I also had a lot of fun drawing on cat photos. This is another one of these common traps for developers. I have a heading with Z-index 10. I have an image with z-index 1. I've forced them to overlap with some negative margin. And unfortunately, the image is covering up the text. Now, most developers understand that the higher the z-index, the closer to the viewer it's supposed to be. So when I say z-index 10, it should sit in front of the image. Now, this is something I understood for quite a while, so it's not something that was part of my 2017 era rebirth. So if I go back in time and I try to imagine how I would have explained this in 2012, I would have said something like this. Let me get into character. OK, the z-index property has a dependency on the position property. So if I want to use z-index, I have to use position. And if I set position relative, then this sort of activates this property. There's this sort of dependency between them, and then it'll do what we want. Now, back to my current day self. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. Well, first thing, actually, we don't even need z-index in this position. If I get rid of all that z-index, well, now it works. Because anything that uses positioned layout will automatically be promoted to sit in front of elements that don't. So position relative on its own is sufficient to solve this problem. But even then, z-index has nothing to do, well, it has something to do with the position property, but only indirectly. Really, the way to explain this is that different layout modes implement different properties. So when I write z-index 10, the browser takes this property as an argument, and it hands it to the flow layout function, right? It calls flow layout with this declaration as an argument. And flow layout says, I have no idea what to do with this, right? It's the same thing as if I said food, spaghetti, spaghetti. I don't know what to do with that. That doesn't mean anything to me. What we want to do is make sure that we're using a layout mode that implements the property. And positioned layout will do that, right? That's why all of a sudden we're handing the same CSS to a different layout mode and says, oh, I know what to do with this. But it's not the only one that does. And this actually blew my mind when I first discovered it. If I select the parent, so the main tag, and I'm going to give it display grid, and then I'm going to get rid of this, well, we're back to where we started. But now I can use z-index. And it works. Because the grid layout mode implements z-index. So does Flexbox. If I set display flex, and then flex direction column, just so that the elements continue to overlap, that also works. And it works the exact same way. If the image has a bigger value, then it will sit in front, and I can sort of change which one shows up in front. So it's really about using the properties with layout modes that implement them. All right. This, unlike the previous one, was something that continued to baffle me until a few years ago, which is I have this header. It has position relative z-index 2. So I'm using z-index, but I'm using it with the correct layout mode, like a layout mode that implements it. I have this tooltip, which uses position absolute and a much larger z-index value. But for some reason, the tooltip, and I know this might be a little bit hard to see, it is sitting firmly behind the heading, or the header. Well, that's weird, right? It's a bigger number. Maybe it's not big enough. Let's keep going. Maybe now? The problem with this is that z-index values are not compared globally. So if we were to sort of paint the DOM with the actual value that it's using, header has a z-index of 2, but then this main element has position relative z-index 1, which means that this main element is also sort of participating in this context. And it means that anything inside this main tag is going to sit as a group, either above or below anything in this group. Right? Using position relative and a z-index is one of the many ways to create a stacking context which effectively flattens everything inside. And so when I add the z-index value, and let's reduce this a little bit, to this tooltip, it's not like I'm setting this to be this big value. It's more like I'm setting it to be this, 1.999. It's a little bit like semantic versioning is how I explain this for JavaScript developers. It doesn't matter how big the minor version is. 1 dot anything is always going to be less than 2. So the z-index on this value is allowing me to change whether this tooltip, let me give ourselves a little more space, whether it shows up above or below this paragraph. But it's not doing anything to help with the header. So how do we fix this? Well, really the solution would be to use the popover API, because this is a really terrible way to implement a tooltip. But we're ignoring that for the purposes of this demo. Again, we often use z-index more than we have to. If I get rid of that, it works. And this is another thing that trips people up. You assume that, like, OK, if this element and this element are siblings, then this element is either going to be in front or behind. But really, it's not about the DOM structure. It's not about, like, two siblings in the DOM are going to be compared. It's about stacking contexts. And so if I don't make a stacking context on the main, then I remove that initial number. And now it actually is comparing this value and this one. So this is like, I feel like I've done a whirlwind highlight of some of the more effective little bits of things that I've been able to cover. I want to talk a little bit about why I started doing this. Because I mentioned, right, like I had this transformation with CSS myself. And that's true, but I had wanted to create courses for quite a while. In 2020, I hurt my nerve. Frustratingly, I was in physiotherapy, and an exercise that I got caused me to become injured, which really feels unfair, right? And so, to make a very long story short, there was a period of time where this was my desk setup. Oh, what happened to my... Aha, there it is. I had no keyboard, and I had no mouse, because my arms would burn when I would try to use them. And so for quite a while, and it's hard to see, if I zoom in really close here, I had an eye tracker on the front of my iMac that worked as a mouse and a keyboard, or a microphone that acted like a keyboard. And with these two things, I was able to code and write blog posts and build my course platform. But it was definitely an eye-opening experience. No pun intended there. What it made me realize, and I apologize, this is a little bit morbid, all of us have like, and again, image loading. It'll show up eventually. All of us have like a box floating above our head with a number in it, and that's the number of keystrokes we have left to make in our life. So every time you press a key, that number goes down by 1. And you know, hopefully it's in the millions, but it's a finite resource, and I should be using that resource on things that are meaningful to me. And so that was sort of the push that I needed. Let me try. There we are. Yes, this is what was supposed to show up. Yeah, this person's in trouble over here. So, you know, you should treat this as the resource that it is and do things that are meaningful to you. In my case, that was creating courses. It can be anything, though. Like, hopefully, this just serves as a good reminder that, like, we don't have an infinite amount of time or an infinite amount of typing ability. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about. Thanks so much.
Josh, thank you.
Hello.
Welcome to my office. Feel free to throw in some questions here. You were explaining everything, I think.
That's what I try to do, is preemptively answer questions.
Yeah, great. Well, I had one.
Okay.
Do you ever use internal and external, the two values of display?
What do you mean by internal, external? Oh, you mean like when you say like inline space block rather than...
Right.
Yeah, or like inline flex.
Yeah.
No, I should. That would be a good idea. It doesn't usually occur to me to. And I guess I almost never need to use an inline element that also creates a flex formatting context. Like that's just not like a use case that I run into that often. But yeah.
Well, and you can also use inline dash flex. They both work. I just think of it as a way of explaining, another way of explaining the same thing you were talking about, right?
That's a good idea.
You've got the inline block is inline on the outside, and block on the inside.
Oh, I'm stealing that.
Great.
By the way, anything I covered was intended to be stolen. So please, if you ever encounter somebody who could benefit from one of these analogies, the point is that people will use them. And I will, hopefully with your consent, do the same thing with that explanation.
Absolutely. I'm sure I stole it from somewhere. So that's how we do.
Right.
Would you say that it's useful or necessary for designers who have not yet touched code to have some understanding of the various CSS concepts like Flexbox, like layout modes,
right.
Positioning, etc.?
This person's trying to get me in trouble because I feel like that's a difficult question to answer. Should them? No, they shouldn't or should they have to do that? No, right? Like it's a discrete job. It's beneficial for them to understand sort of the basics of CSS, especially because that'll help them understand what is or is not possible. But it's also sort of our job, right? Like if we get a design that does something either impossible or very complex, we're the ones that are supposed to know that and sort of help the designer understand in the same way that I think it's really beneficial for developers to learn a little bit about design. So I think there's benefits to crossover. Like certainly I've inadvertently had to learn quite a bit about design because I build things that need interfaces. But yeah, I think that it's beneficial either way, but there shouldn't be an expectation that the person learn something that is outside of their sort of craft.
Yeah, I think that goes back also to something that was said yesterday. I don't remember who, but about working on teams. We work on teams.
Right.
We can work together, actually.
It is. Like I know a lot of developers really try to avoid meetings, like to try and have as much focus time as possible. But I always tried to get myself invited to design meetings because I found like if I'm in the room, I can catch something really early in the process and be like, oh, actually, that's really hard because of X technical constraint. And it's before the designers have had a chance to like bond with that idea and become more sort of resilient to changing it. So before they've spent the next 3 weeks doing like high fidelity mock-ups of this thing, like we can just chime in and say like, hey, could we maybe do this other thing that is similar but a lot less work on our side? So I always try to encourage people to be more involved in that, like developers to be more involved in the design process for exactly that reason.
Excellent. Yeah, yeah. Great. Thank you again, Josh.